IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. On the 19th of February, foreign ministers of the four Quad countries, India, the US, Japan, and Australia, held a 90-minute long meeting via phone. This was, of course, the first Quad meeting since the Biden administration took over in the US, and it was clearly a chance for the new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to get to know his Quad counterparts. Now, from what we are told, Myanmar was the main topic of discussion in this meeting. But as we all know, China remains the most important driver of Quad cooperation. And instead of talking about China more broadly today, I'm joined today by Suyash. And I want to ask him more specifically about some of the developments in China that are perhaps driving this Quad cooperation most, specifically China's naval expansion. We've very recently had the disengagement in Ladakh with China. And yet, at the same time, our relations with China remain tense and problematic, and we are likely to see continued competition in the naval sphere. So, Suyash, let's start by talking about a concept that is dear to the PLA Navy, which is the idea of near seas and far seas. On the 23rd of April is PLA Navy Day. What is China doing in what it calls the near seas and the far seas? And why does that matter to India and the other countries of the Quad?
First of all, thanks, Aditya, for having me. Just a factoid before we talk about China's near seas and far seas. A report came out this week that China has dethroned US to be India's largest trading partner despite all the arguments about coupling and decoupling happening for the last year. So that's an interesting fact. Now, coming to the question regarding near seas and far seas. So China divides its maritime approach in two parts. One is the near seas, which largely consists of three seas, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, where majority of Chinese disputes are happening right now, and the far seas, which is the Western Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean right now. Because of the limited capabilities, that is why far seas described as, these two oceans are described as far seas. When Chinese capabilities increase, it can extend to the Mediterranean Sea, to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Arctic. But right now, they are confined to these two oceans. There are a lot of speeches happening and a lot of importance given on these regions, especially. So I have read a recent article where since Xi Jinping came to power, the near seas were mentioned almost 49% of the total. In the foreign policy speech, 49% of importance, there is a metric of calculating it, was given to near seas and especially South China Sea. We've also seen how South China Sea militarization has happened in the past decade. So, since he came to power, he has emphasized on something called as informatization. In 2017 Congress party meeting, he said that mechanization, informatization, and converting PLA into world-class force are his targets for the Chinese military. So informatization is very important here. And informatization to win the local wars. This is something that China came out in 2003. So informatization, information warfare to win the local wars is you can say a slogan for Xi Jinping to deal with, or China to deal with, the near seas region. When we talk about informatization, it can be broadly classified into two or three things. First, the primary thing which they are already doing, increased capabilities. That's irrespective of informatization, capabilities should be increased. Two, and this is the added layer to what China is doing in South China Sea and East China Sea and the near seas region, that is increasing, adding a sphere of informatization, that is information warfare, developing underwater unmanned capabilities, using UAVs, using UUVs to control the region, so that the manual touch point or the physical touch point can be reduced, and also developing SSF, developing a part of sea denial, developing in this area in such a way that you could blind enemy combatant. For example, if there is an escalation in the South China Sea, the enemy or the adversary could be blind, making this region, completely controlling this region to blind the enemy during an escalation. This is something which is a very important part of information warfare. How much they have succeeded, we cannot identify that unless and until there is some major escalation or China goes to war. But the rhetoric or the propaganda that comes out of China every week, at least the propaganda shows that they have been able to very much develop sea denial capabilities and heading towards information warfare in the 3Cs. Not only the Chinese propaganda, but a lot of information that lot of analysis that Western scholars have done over so many years in the region also show that if China goes to war tomorrow, a lot of casualties there. An adversary like the United States, which is one of the most powerful nations in the world, or the most powerful nation in the world, will not go unharmed, or there will be a lot of damage on United States because of the informational warfare capabilities that China has built in the near seas region. That is something that I could broadly define as near seas. So basically, use of UAVs, blinding the adversaries, use of underwater vessels, unmanned vessels. These are the broad things that you could identify as near seas.
And so how does that differ from the approach to the far seas?
Now, far seas is something that China is worried about since a very long time. We'll have to go back to history to trace far seas, near history. I think there was something, Hu Jintao in 2004 mentioned the Malacca dilemma. The Malacca dilemma is what if there is something called as I'm sure our listeners are aware with something called as flocks, which are also known as which are expanded into sea lanes of communication. These are basically sea routes on which a lot of international trade and commerce happens, So in 2004, Hu Jintao in a speech said that there is something called as Malacca dilemma. In case of an escalation with any of the adversary, one of the important choke points on the Eastern Indian Ocean can be blocked. And if that is blocked, the Chinese economy will be crippled. If there is a naval blockade employed at the Malacca Strait, Chinese economy could be crippled because a lot of trade transit happens through that region. Since then, they have focused on something called as the far seas. So they have not said something called as the far seas until Xi Jinping came to power, but their overall approach has indicated that they are focusing on far seas. There are three ways in there. You can identify three important factors in their approach towards far seas. First, the capability development that they started since 2004. Three important capabilities are we can highlight three important capabilities. After 2004, they started reworking on their first aircraft carrier. They started building their LPDs, and they started building they commissioned their first ARC hospital, naval ship hospital. That's point number one. Point number two, since 2008, they started operating very much into the Indian Ocean region. That is the counter. These are HADR operations, but very much into Indian Ocean region for counter piracy operations, for supporting their overseas placement deployments. Also going back a little in 2000, so Mao Zedong had stated that whatever happens, China will not deploy any soldiers, any of its PLA personnel on any of the foreign land. But this also changed in 2002 when under Hu Jintao, I think it was Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, I'm not sure about that, when this policy was changed. But China started deploying a lot of PLA personnels for HADR missions in Africa, for instance. Also, their investment started, and so they started coming in. So, due to all these dependencies, under Xi, China has commissioned a word called as far seas, where China says that it has to protect its interest far seas. And this was also officially came out in the 2013 Defense White Paper, and which was followed up very poignantly in 2015 Defense White Paper, where China said that the PLA should focus on near seas and far seas interest. It should protect its near seas and far seas interest. The doctrine should change, and it should develop more and more capabilities. I remember in 2018 or 19, there was a report in Chinese media where it said that it was only in Chinese media and not in English media. It said that it has stopped building corvettes now. And now PLA is more focused on building frigates, destroyers, and bigger vessels. This implies that they are more comfortable in taking care or handling their near seas region, and their focus is now shifting to near sea protection and far seas interest protection. This is what, so something was commissioned, an idea came out in 2004, 2003. A number of things, developments have happened, and now they are reaching a stage of comfort in near seas and addressing their far seas issues slowly and steadily.
Right. So this expansion into the far seas is is along the lines of a fairly expected trajectory. As Chinese power rises, as it becomes more dependent on global trade. Can you give us a sense of some of these HADR or humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations that the Chinese have undertaken in recent times? And also, for our audience, can you tell us where China's base or facility in Djibouti fits into the picture?
A lot of humanitarian HADR operations, Chinese have undertaken a lot of HADR operations in Africa especially. There is a reason for China to do that. It's a cliche that a lot of people say that the PLA is not battle ready. So PLA cannot fight any war because the last war they fought was 1979 Vietnam War. Okay, all of this is true. But there are two reasons for that. One is the PLA, quote unquote, incapabilities of PLA. They try to overcome these and get them combat ready, get the PLA combat ready by undertaking such operations in the African continent. That's one. And two, to change the world opinion and project that China is internationalizing. China has stake in the world. It's a major international player. For that, they have undertaken a lot of, it's a credible international player. It's one of the important world powers. For that, they have also undertaken a lot of operations in the African continent. And third important point is Xi Jinping's flagship project, the Belt and Road Initiative. That has also come along the lines. So that is a separate from the point from the first 2 points. It doesn't directly come under the HADR operations, but also since 2013, especially when Xi's flagship project was rolled out, a lot of investment has happened in Africa. Major African states have signed up to the BRI, which is called as Belt and Road Initiative. So due to this investment, a lot of Chinese soldiers are also deployed in this region. Chinese contractors are all, not soldiers, are also deployed in this region. So all this, if you see together, it fits that China also has to enter into Indian Ocean to protect it in its interest. Coming back to the point that you raised regarding Djibouti, so also Mao Zedong had stated in the past that China will never ever employ or make a base in a foreign military base. But that was also overturned under Xi's regime, and China made commissioned or made a first overseas base in the Indian Ocean region at Djibouti. Now the US DOD's report claims that there could be more bases in the future. Pakistan is one candidate, Cambodia is another candidate for that. But yes, how is this base used? So it helps China for establishing its presence near locks. It helps China for getting involved into engaging in counter-piracy operation in the Western Indian Ocean region. And also it helps China to take care of logistics for their HADR operations in the African continent. These are the primary reasons. Also, in case of escalation, this base can be used, but it's too early to say that because there are very limited capabilities at that basis which can take care of an escalation. Also, one important point that we don't highlight, or the Indian media doesn't highlight, is regarding three other bases which are also there at Djibouti, which includes French base, an Italian base, if I'm not wrong, and a US base. So, yes, people can argue for the sake of argument that escalation can happen through that base. But more importantly, it is for protecting their interests in Africa and Western Indian Ocean region.
All right. I want to now situate what you've talked about with China's naval strategy with its broader understanding of how its military force is supposed to be used. China, of course, has this well-known document called the Science of Military Strategy. The first iteration came out in 2001, and there was a shorter, more updated version in 2013. And this has been in the news quite recently. Can you tell us what the Science of Military Strategy, which is this major doctrinal publication, what it says about India specifically?
I think, Aditya, first SMS, Science of Military Strategy, was published in 1987. Second one was published in 2001, and third one was published in 2013, which is the recent one. So SMS, which is Science of Military Strategy, is published after every 13 years. So the recent one, there is a passage dedicated to India. In that passage, China says that India is a regional power. It's a major South Asian power, and its interests are in the South Asian region. It's occupied on two fronts, and majorly devoting its resources to the land. But as it gets comfortable along the land, and as its economy grows, it will venture out into the Indian Ocean region. It will be a major power in the Indian Ocean region in the future. This is the most important thing. Apart from all the things that they say in the Science of Military Strategy, they consider India can be a future power. So what this implies is a particular. So there are a lot of theories on how China or PLA does all the things, why China and PLA does all the things related to India, why there is always an escalation. One of the theory, and the important theory, is that China wants to keep India entangled on land so that we don't venture out into the ocean. We are entangled with Pakistan, we are entangled with China on the land, so that we cannot provide adequate resources to our naval forces or our naval development, which will restrict us in the Indian, which is restrict us as a land power, as a South Asian power. A lot of people have counter-argued that India is not only the headache for China. There is a significant US presence in the Indian Ocean region. There is a French presence in the Indian Ocean region. But having said that, the geography of India is such that China has to consider limiting India in the Indian Ocean region, and which is implied through this document up to a certain extent, that China, it does fit into PLA calculation that India, if comfortable on its both boundaries, can venture into the Indian Ocean region, which can be potentially problematic for China. You also have to consider the Andaman Nicobar Tri-Command base, which is situated right on the Malacca Strait, right, very close to Malacca Strait. Even if they decide to make Kra Canal tomorrow, Kra Canal will go through Thailand. So if you take out the map, you can see that it will be on the mouth of Kra Canal. So it gives an advantage, and this all things are in Chinese calculations, and that is why perhaps we could speculate that China is entangling India on the land. Of course, there are other problems for India-China escalation on border, historic sense, sovereignty issue, etc. But this can be one of the reasons which can be implied through reading Science of Military Strategy.
Okay. Now, considering that this is China's approach to the near seas, far seas, and more specifically to India, how has India responded? And also, what do you think India should do differently?
So, Aditya, I'll not talk about the economic and diplomatic things that India can do vis-a-vis China. For that, you will have to read my upcoming document. It's on India's response to China, what India can do in the future. But I'll only briefly talk about few things that India can do in case of military. One, we should focus on capabilities. That is, Aditya and I have always argued that we should focus on capabilities development. Such a big nation, and we don't have indigenous capacities. We also don't have money to import a lot of things. Our finances are restricted. So capabilities development is one. Two, now that de-escalation is happening slowly and steadily, disengagement has happened on Pangong, and soon possibly we'll see de-escalation on the northern borders. That shouldn't lead to lack of interest in Quad. And that has happened in the past, because if I remember correctly, 2006 was when Quad idea was initiated, and it took almost a decade and a half for Quad to be elevated from a junior officer level to foreign ministerial level forum. So all the four countries procrastinated at different stages. So yes, now that de-escalation is happening, Quad systems, partnerships like Quad shouldn't be ignored. In fact, partnerships can be expanded, and countries in the South China Sea, which are also facing problems from China, can be a part of such partnerships. That is another thing that India can do. Third, Aditya, you've discussed India using some advanced capabilities. Would you like to emphasize on that?
Yeah, sure. In the naval sphere specifically, India needs to really up its game on things like UUVs, autonomous vehicles. We need to focus on our submarine warfare and anti-submarine warfare capabilities, build more extensive hydrophone detection nets, for example. And India really needs to up its satellite coverage of the region. We have a fairly good infrastructure for satellite communication for our naval vessels. We also need much greater ISR capabilities over there, which will be important for tracking vessels during peacetime, but also, for targeting vessels during crises or war. All of these capabilities will be seen by the Chinese and understood. So I think that those are places where India has some advantages, because it is always much harder for China to project power into these regions than for India to simply be in its own backyard. And if it develops these type of capabilities, it makes the ability of China to operate there on its own terms more difficult. Now, this is not to say that India should purely adopt some sort of sea denial capability. I think the discussion on India's broader naval strategies is more complicated. So while China is obviously a major problem for India, India's ambitions, its own interests are much greater. And so it has to figure out some creative ways in which to square those ambitions and those actual needs that the country has with the reality that it has this constrained financial situation. But of course, that is a topic for perhaps another episode, or perhaps 2 or 10 or 100 episodes more. And I'm sure we'll continue to discuss India's options and China's own doctrines, its strategies, and its diplomacy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Suyash. And we'll, like I said, undoubtedly have many more such episodes.
Thank you, Aditya.
And thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on our network this week, Seat Tires. So we had a fantastic week. Tune into This Round is on Me, where Gauri Devidayal has a chat with Divya Ravichandran on the issues of waste management in India and how recycling, composting, and using eco-friendly alternatives can help. On Filter Coffee Podcast, Karthik speaks with Lux Narayan about his book Name, Place, Animal, Thing, an inspiring non-fiction fable about hope, positivity, and living your best life. On All Things Policy, Anirudh Kanisetti talks to Prateek Wakre and Rohan Sheth about Australia's conflict with Facebook and Google and what this means for big tech companies and the news ecosystem. On the Simplified Podcast, Naren and Tony talk about greenwashing, which is businesses unfairly marketing themselves as eco-friendly just to ride the sustainability wave. You should also check out the Cyrus Says episode with Varun Deshpande of the Good Food Institute, where they talk about plant-based alternatives. Varun does a great show with us called Feeding 10 Billion. Do check out this episode of Cyrus Says. They have a really interesting conversation. On the Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok speak to the badminton doubles player Satvik Sairaj about his successful stints at some of the recently concluded games. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, dear friends. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. Life, as you know, is a journey. And you and I, travelers, how can we celebrate this travel? I have a podcast for you, Begin the Journey. I share stories and moments from my life. Do tune in every Monday and Thursday to listen to my podcast on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from. Cheers.